I'm going to take about an hour and a half, and I'm going to talk about various aspects of the new City of Mental Physics, which was the original name of the property that you are now at. We're going to talk a little bit about the National Register of Historic Places landmark application. I'm going to introduce Edwin John Dingle, aka Ding Le Mei, and then, because I'm an architectural historian, I'm going to talk about the architecture. All right. Okay, so this is the first slide here. And this is a very typical National Register of Historic Places landmark application. This was the application for this property. And the application in total is about 150 pages. I'm not going to show all 150 of them or read from all 150 of them. But what I want to point out here is just a couple of things. On the second page there, under Section 8, you'll see there's applicable National Register criteria. So anytime something is listed on the National Register of Historic Places in the United States, and this is a federal listing, it has to be eligible under one or more eligibility criteria. So here at this property, you only have to be eligible for one, but this property was eligible under 3. I found my laser. The chapstick in my pocket wasn't going to work, so the laser. So, okay, so this property is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. What I did on this nomination is I framed this property relative to the early advent of alternative spiritual disciplines and the New Age movement in Southern California. This was a very early property to that narrative, and we'll talk about that. This property is associated with the lives of persons significant to our past. Edwin John Dingle, and we'll talk about him. Very, very distinctive individual. Very, very accomplished. And finally, this property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. And that's where we get into the architecture. This criterion D here is only for archaeology, and we weren't too concerned about that here, so we just didn't check that box. Here's your diagram. There are a lot of buildings here. I think this is approximately 150 acres, give or take. And the nomination had to describe every one of these. It was a lot of writing. And all of them were determined eligible for various reasons. And I'm going to show you some pictures of these buildings in this presentation. Now, I want to start off a little bit about Edwin John Dingle. There he is in the upper left. He was born on April 6th, 1881 in Pioneertown, England, which is in the area of Cornwall. And here he is probably right after he started mental physics in around the late 1930s, I would say early 1940s. This is the property about 1960, give or take. And if you look at the site plan, it's one giant hexagon. And there are a lot of hexagons on this property, a lot of hexagons and a lot of triangles. So we are right here in the first sanctuary of mystic Christianity. That was the original name of this building. There are the apartments over here. This is the Caravansary of Joy. That's his name for it. And some other buildings here. This is the outdoor amphitheater area in the middle. So Dingle had a very interesting early life. His father was a printer in the London Evening News, and his mother passed away at his birth. She died. He never knew her. He was raised by his grandmother early on in his life, and when he was a little bit older, he lived with his uncle. So when we did this nomination, we did a lot of homework. And this is a census record from England. I think I want to say that one's 1890, and there's Edwin Dingle kind of in the middle with his family. Here he is with a picture of his parents. This was from a memorial booklet when he died. So I didn't write that, somebody else did. I tried to stay very objective in the nomination. He may or may not have been a man of destiny, but that's what that says. And there he is there's an image of his grandmother. That's him later in life, holding an image of his parents. So he was always really interested in the Far East. So of course this is before the internet, this is before globalism, this is before airplanes for that matter. So these far off places are written about and they're seen as very exotic. And so for people like Dingle who are from cold, foggy England, there was probably a real appeal to that. You would be able to go into English gardens back in the 19th century even and see pagodas and other Asiatic, they called it Oriental. I don't think that's the best term to use anymore, but far off places in various English gardens. And this Asia intrigued him. And by the time he's very young, he's a journalist. He's working in the family trade. His dad was in journalism. He was a printer. And his uncle gets him a job with some papers in Bristol, England. By 1901, when he's only 21, he's a West Indies correspondent. So he's already traveling to Jamaica and kind of far off places. And by 1904, he gets a job in Singapore with the Singapore Straits Times, which is still around to this day. He was doing advertising there, and he kind of worked his way up to being a journalist. By 1906, he was the superintendent and manager of the printing department. You're going to see he's a very, very good printer. And because he's such a good printer, that informs his ability to get the word out about mental physics, which he is very, very good at and very adept at. In 1909, kind of spontaneously with a friend of his, he decided, he was in Singapore, he said, I'm going to travel China, and I'm going to walk it. He decides to travel China by walking in 1909, 1910, he walks hundreds of miles across China. And I'm sure he got on a carriage on some of that. But he traveled China on foot and shot these remarkable glass slides, of which there are hundreds here. I think there's probably a couple in the exhibit somewhere. There he is in 1909. And just these various images, which now, probably just one of a kind. He writes this book in 1911, covering his journey from, I don't remember where he started, if it was Dongchuan or where, but he ends up in Burma, which back then was Bamo. And he ends up in Burma, today Myanmar, and he documents in great detail every last part of his journey. He takes pictures. Here's where I was on this day. Here's who I met. He's a remarkable journalist. And as a result of doing this, he ends up becoming a remarkable cartographer a little bit later. Now, the Chinese Revolution begins in 1911. And he becomes one of the primary journalists to cover that, and his articles are syndicated all over the United States. So these are articles from US newspapers written by Dingle covering the Chinese Revolution. And there he is on the Nanking City Wall. That's him in the fur coat in the lower right. And so, already, by then he's only, 31. He's 31 years old. Everybody always looks so much older back then. He's only, what, born in 1880, right? 31, right? Is that right? Looks like he's 60. So, I don't know. It's just me. He marries in 1912 Dr. Lillian Mary Grandin in the upper right. And she's a rather remarkable individual in her own right. She was an early missionary doctor to China. And she's been written about a lot. She was from Jersey, which of course is part of England. And she has her own stamp. So she is somebody considered very significant as an early female doctor working in China, which is kind of remarkable. Their marriage did not last long. They were separated by 1918, and actually she passed away in 1924. She was only 47. In 1913, Dingle establishes what's called the Far Eastern Geographical Establishment. And through this enterprise, Dingle would create one of the first major maps of China to be adopted across the Western world. So his bilingual new map of China was published originally in 1914 with revised editions over the following 2 years. He was a friend and confidant of the future president of the Chinese Republic, Li Yonghong. And the undertaking of this mapping may have been done with Yonghong's blessing. So he had some friends in high places back then. And there he is in the middle of this group portrait right there. And there's the atlas. Actually, I think it's over there. You should definitely take a look at it. It's just an incredible, incredible book. Just remarkable, the information, the detail. And so that's called the New Atlas and Commercial Gazetteer of China. That remains the primary map for China until World War II. So it has a lot of relevance for a long time. There's some details from the Commercial Gazetteer, just a railway map of China, aspects of China's tea trade, just everything you would need to know. I mean, that seems so prescient now. Anyway, now in 1918, Dingle came to New York, and his wife, Lillian, they were separated by then. And he became an editor of the China Far East and Finance Commerce, another newspaper. And then in the 20s, he ends up in California. He moves to California around 1921, and he settles in Oakland. And he lives there through at least 1930. There's the census record, with second wife Cecilia and their 2 children, Edwin Jr. and Richard. And during this time, he seems to have gone through a metamorphosis of some kind. He starts undertaking these various breathing exercises, breathwork exercises, pranayama, which he learned about in the East. And here's some glass slides of him doing some of the exercises. He seems to have gone through some sort of transformation. My understanding is he had some health ailments, he had failing eyesight, and he claimed these exercises to really help him get better. He undertook a variety of breathing exercises, dietary restrictions, and meditation. So this is in the 1920s he's doing this. This is very, very early to what is now part of our culture here in Southern California and Joshua Tree, of course. And this is ultimately going to lead to mental physics itself. So early on, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he starts giving lectures, initially in New York, at the New York Psychological Club. And there's little articles about his lectures here. Savant discovers breath important to human life. And during this time, in the late 1920s, as he's beginning this, he changes his name to Ding Le Mei. And I believe in Chinese, it might be Mandarin, someone may know better than me. Ding means someone of power or strength, but it's also Dingle if you just take away the dots. So it's D-I-N-G-L-E hyphen Mei. So there you have it. And so he goes by Ding Le Mei during this time. And on November 7th, 1927, keep up with some of these dates because they reoccur. On November 7th, 1927, in New York, he establishes the science of mental physics. And he gave various lectures in New York between 1927 and 1930, primarily at the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce building and Steinway Hall, where he retained an office. He comes to LA for the first time in 1931, and he lectures at Trinity Auditorium, which I think is downtown. I think it's still there, actually. It's I think they're working on it. It may have been red tagged in the '94 earthquake. And he gets press from even his very first lecture here. The LA Times is calling him Dingle. They're not calling him Ding Le Mei. He kind of goes back and forth, you know. You could choose the name that you feel like calling him at a given point, I guess. So I want to talk a little bit about what the original intention of mental physics was based off the information that I have. There may be folks in this audience. I've met practitioners who have been, doing the breathwork for many years now. I've met practitioners who were here for over 50 years. So pardon me if I get some of the details wrong. I'm sure there are people who are living mental physics who may know some of this better than I, but this is my understanding. One of the primary points here was to proclaim and teach the eternal truth of life, and to spread the light of divine wisdom working through the natural law and the holy trinity of body, mind, and spirit of man. And so you're going to see a lot of triangles, and body, mind, and spirit is referenced in that trinity quite often. Not so much a religion as a teaching discipline. So he doesn't mean to start a new religion. He's not claiming to be God or anything like that. He's not saying, follow me. It's about teaching. And it marked itself as a highly specialized school, making available to all who desire to learn the fundamental teaching of all great spiritual scientists and teachers of the ages. And he says, its teaching is what the whole world is consciously or unconsciously seeking. Pretty confident about that. He's interested in taking what he learns about breath work. It's focused upon various individual well-being exercises, emphasizing the breathing exercises, the pranayama, meditation and dietary guidelines, and with this, and this becomes important, right thinking, to think your way to health. And that is a part of a bigger movement called New Thought. And visualization exercises, which people do now. So many of these things are still around now. They're encouraged. He's doing this very, very early and teaching them as ways to try to help people get empowered. Mental physics, when it was started in 1927, it was started by a group who wanted him to teach them. They pulled him aside from one of his lectures and said, teach us. And that's when he sort of states that mental physics first began in New York at that time. Now, this fits into a larger California context. I just have this picture of him. First and forever, there is God. He's not claiming to be God himself. He's just trying to get people connected to this idea of God. And this, again, is from a memorial flyer of when he passed. He starts mental physics in New York, but he eventually establishes the Institute of Mental Physics 7 years to the day later on November 7th, 1934. And he establishes it in Los Angeles. Los Angeles, from about the 1890s through before World War II, you had a lot of people moving west. The population of Los Angeles increased between 1890 and 1920. It increased 530%. So this was a fast-growing area with a lot of people moving westward. The region's relatively unchanging and warm climate was seen as a selling point for health and fostered what author John Barr referred to as a propaganda for health. So all of this stuff about being healthy And a lot of this is about the individual and individual health and well-being. And we would think now, okay, well, a lot of people who are into this now are sort of like countercultural or different. But here's an early picture of mental physics practitioners from back in the day, including some of the preceptors, those who had gone through the training. And this has been well documented. A lot of these alternative sort of groups, not all of them, but a lot of them, especially the ones about health and well-being, their practitioners weren't, they weren't, people trying to be, different or anything like that, or hipsters or whatever we would assume now. But a lot of times it was Midwestern Protestants. They moved to the West. You're not confined by Main Street anymore and the culture around Main Street. In Southern California, it's horizontal, it's sprawling. You could sort of settle wherever you want, in your own Eden. You're not confined to the old way of doing things. Now, I say this, of course, Los Angeles has the early history of LA was not so great for everyone, particularly if there was segregation and a lot of racism, along with it. So I'm talking in generalities. But at least at mental physics, that clearly wasn't the case. There were people of different backgrounds, race backgrounds, that got involved here, and Dingle was very open to all of it. It was very accommodating for everyone. But I just have this slide up here to show what some of the practitioners were, that they weren't just, they weren't what you may have thought if you're thinking yoga and all of that. In 1893, there was the World's Parliament of Religions at the Columbia Exposition in Chicago, a very famous World's Fair. This was one of the first instances where people of different religious and spiritual backgrounds, whether it's theosophy or Hinduism or Sikhism, Buddhism, all came together. And this really got people interested in what else is out there besides Christianity. Now, it didn't necessarily blossom everywhere. There were a couple of other places things took a hold, New England, Boston, but Southern California was where this really, whether it was theosophy, self-realization fellowship with Paramahamsa Yogananda, whatever it was, there's Krishnamurti under theosophy, and there's Yogananda right there. There was an openness to this possibility of having a different, open mode of thinking. Dingle was part of this context. And there's a really interesting statistic here from 1920 to 1945, right when mental physics is established. Los Angeles itself had approximately 200,000 temporary residents. This is from a very famous book by writer Carrie McWilliams called Island on the Land. And people are moving here fast. They don't even have a place to live yet. So this is an area of a migratory mindset. It's not only is there not settlement, but because there's not settlement, you don't have to do things the typical way. There's an openness here, and Dingle was part of that early history. So I just have a couple of other figures up here. Krishnamurti was associated with theosophy. He was sort of found at a young age, at age 9 in India, and those who found him kind of raised him to be like a kind of a new messianic figure, and he was based in Hollywood at the Crotona Society and then Ojai. He walks away from it when he's in his 30s. He says, truth is a pathless land. There's no one right way. But he gave lectures the rest of his life upon this. And then Paramahamsa Yogananda, who very, very early on brought yoga and a lot of that to Southern California. I think he got here in the early 1920s, and he was quite a sensation and spoke in Washington, and his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, is popular even now. It's sold millions of copies. And this is where, a lot of this sort of takes hold, whether it's theosophy or self-realization fellowship, or in this case, new thought. So back to this. In the upper left, you have this mystical figure named Emanuel Swedenborg, and then next to him, you have, oh boy, I can't find his name. That's okay. This is an early figure in the New Thought movement from Maine, basically. It'll come to me in about 45 minutes. And then you have, Phineas Quimby. It didn't take that long. So Phineas Quimby over there. And the whole idea of New Thought. And some of this may sound familiar to you if you've been around Christian Science or religious science, that Quimby believed that disease was caused by erroneous thought, and that diseases could be cured through the power of the mind, especially through positive thinking, attitude, affirmation, and what might better be known today as visualization. Much of mental physics focus, like much of early New Thought, tends toward healing and wellness. New Thought later gets used for abundance, make me rich. But in the early days, it's more about keep me healthy, or maybe keep me kind of young. And so now, people now, Deepak Chopra, or, figures like that. New Thought is still very much around, even Robert Schuller's version of it with Christianity when the Crystal Cathedral was around. So this New Thought strain is very much part of the California context. And then the fellow here with the red, that's Ernest Holmes, and he founds the Church of Religious Science, or Science of Mind. Today, this is still around as Centers for Spiritual Living. And he finds this in February of 1927 in LA, 6 months before Dingle starts mental physics. So, and a lot of mental physics kind of borrows from religious science. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but Dingle is putting an Eastern spin on a lot of it. The religious science talked about affirmative prayer and spiritual mind treatment. And Holmes was open about his interest not just in Christianity, but in Buddhism. And in a quote that seems to borrow heavily from, earlier mission statements of like theosophy, which was already around, he stated that, quote unquote, religious science is a correlation of laws of science, opinions, and philosophy and revelations of religion applied to human needs and the aspirations of man. So it's all about empowering you. And so anyway, Dingle establishes mental physics on November 7th, 1934. He gets a hold of this former Methodist church in Koreatown, which is still there in LA, and this becomes the headquarters of the science of mental physics. And the full name of there's the science, which is 1927, and the institute, which is sort of the official sort of organ of it. The full name of this was the Institute of Mentalphysics of the Church Invisible. Kind of nice. But there it is right there. It's not totally invisible, but it's headquarters. Beautiful building done by John Vaughter and Albert Walker. This is 1913, this building. And this Methodist church, which was here, had merged with another one, and so they didn't really need this building anymore. And so Dingle establishes right in the middle of all these people moving to California, of the presence of other similar spiritual disciplines already. So he's not the very first, but he's one of them. And because he's a good printer, from his background, he starts printing a lot. And all these marketing materials seem to really help him get the word out. So there was a lot of through the mail mysticism, if you will, with mental physics. A lot of ads. Well, just send away. We'll give you copies, and you could read this. Here's some of his the lamplighter. In fact, I think that same lamp in this image is in the preceptory building now. It's still there, in the middle. Okay. He has these teachings for people who are sort of very serious, called the inner sanctum teachings. So there's all of these sort of layers of his teaching. So he has what's called the Inner Sanctum teachings had 5 confidential mental physics principles of their own, embodied in secrecy, intensity, personal conspiracy, true desire, and evolutionary action. So he's a very kind of a florid writer in some ways. And he, in these early, the beginning level, there's a 26-part initiate group course in advanced teachings and 124 Ding Le Mei commentaries. There's what's called the baby class for the new people. You could take the baby class. And there's large multicolored charts, as you see here. It's kind of a beautiful chart on the right. I think it's in the show right here. And there's some of his information about breathing exercises and moving your body to the breath. You know, the chart's gorgeous. I said this last time, and I'll say it again. It's definitely of another era. I think, now I think we would probably expect to have a little more different skin colors than just 50 Shades of White, but it was a different era. Dingle wasn't, he was not racist or anything like that. It was just of a different era. So there's no, he's not trying to say somebody's above anybody else there. Got commentary on meditation and breathing exercises. He has books on love and sex. Let's see here. Breathing Your Way to Youth. Thought as an electric force, which I think is really interesting because George Van Tassel, who did the Integratron, was really into this idea too. That's a lecture for another day. Breathing Your Way to Youth, all very new thought. This idea of East meets West, and this beautiful mental physics logo, everything is just kind of beautifully done. Even the manual on constipation. So he hated constipation. He calls it the greatest enemy of the whole human race. That's bad. Pretty intense. He's really hard on constipation. He even has records. So the voice of Ding Le Mei in that sort of very wonderful font over there. And it's not just one. It looks like there's, 9 records, 978s. So where he teaches lessons about breath work. So he's very active in getting the word out about this. We're going to shift gears now. I've talked a little bit about mental physics. Now we're going to talk about mental physics, the property. So, seems to be doing very well. Even though he was not a citizen until 1941, he became naturalized then. On August 23rd, 1941, in a sunrise consecration ceremony, he dedicated this land. And it was to be the new city of mental physics at the time. And of course, I don't think you can see all this here, but I want to just point out something. This is an original site plan by Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. This is Highway 62. Here's north, so north is over there. This is, let's see, so this is the Caravansary of Joy. We're about right here. Here's the road. Here's Pioneertown. Here's the base. This was all supposed to be part of mental physics also. It was going to be on either side of the road. There was going to be a school. There was going to be an auto repair shop. There were going to be small buildings, villages, places to live, various, I'll show you some of it. Oh, this doesn't really do you much good. It's pretty small. But this is the original site plan here by Lloyd Wright. We're here, and if you notice here, this is a hexagon, and just even looking at this building, you may think, well, it kind of doesn't look like a perfect hexagon. This was eventually done by someone else, and I'll get to that. Here is the Caravansary of Joy, as it's called. There's the restaurant, and there are the cottages. There's the outdoor amphitheater. And you could see here all the layout is hexagons. Kind of fascinating. I just came across this recently. This was a survey he did of part of the property, and I believe this is the property south of the road. So here's Highway 62, and I'll read this to you because I'm assuming it's kind of hard for you to see here, but the front rodman on the survey is none other than Dingle himself. So he's the main surveyor, and he has a survey crew here, and he's surveying this. This was going to be a V-shaped road. And I know you can't see this, so I'll read it. He did this survey on December 7th, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor was attacked. And I think it was just coincidence. November 7th is an important day to him, right? November 7th, 1927, he started the science of mental physics. November 7th, 1934, he started the Institute. And if you go 7 years from that, on November 7th, 1941, he probably wanted to do something special. I don't know what he did on November 7th, 1941, but a month later, he did his survey, and Pearl Harbor got attacked the same day. I just pulled this out today off Google. So here we are, of course, up here, but look you could still see that road still exists. It's right there. You could barely see it. And so does the other one. You could see just a little bit of it right there. And then it went up there. So this was actually his property, and it was laid out, that road. It's still there to this day. Very, very faint. So, and I think it's this right here. Maybe the property went on. I don't know what's going on down there. I'm not going to go back to the context too much, but Theosophy had their, East meets West spiritual discipline, but that was probably the earliest one in LA. I think it came around the 1880s, just off the top of my head. But some of these buildings are still here off Beechwood Canyon in Hollywood for Crotona, which was going to be a town where the Theosophists were going to live. In fact, Krishnamurti actually lived here before everybody moved to Ojai. And just other sort of upstart utopian colonies in LA, whether they're religious or not. LA, meaning Southern California. Spiritual here, but Little Landers was a group of people who were kind of back to the land and believed that they could start like a communal living arrangement off agriculture and then just go into town and sell everything. It was about the gentleman farmer, and they tried to start their own colonies. And then Llano del Rio here, what's left of it, this was a socialist utopian colony off Pear Blossom Highway near Lancaster, and the remains of that are still there. So there was this milieu in Southern California of trying to start utopian sort of colonies. And remember, this was going to be a city itself. This was supposed to be the new city of mental physics originally. It certainly didn't become that. So some of this early stuff here, there's actually a farm here back there that was called the Agricultural Experiment Station. The Agricultural Experimental Station, kind of wordy. And this is about that way, 2,000 feet. It's still there. That was just taken last year. These really interesting I think these are to hook the horses up to here. And you can't really see it here. It's a little blown out, but see where this green is? On a USGS topographic map, that indicates that there's crops. And there were actually all kinds of crops growing there. Dingle grew all his own food, and various apricots, fruit and nut orchards, pistachios, mulberries, walnuts, apples, nectarines, pears. And there was actually crops growing there through the 70s. And then there started to get, water issues and stuff like that. So the farm was a very early part of this. And this is just the diagram from the National Register nomination, having to, point out every hitching post here and all that. There's an early picture of it with this water tank. And this is just, this is sort of a utilities area, a maintenance area. It's near the older cottages. I put the wrong image up, pardon me. But so the maintenance area in the farm These are just, very basic, but he was doing the infrastructure to build a city. By doing the maintenance area early and the farm early, he was thinking big, and those are very early. He starts building worker housing for the workers who are going to come out here and build this about 1940, at the end of 41 and then 42. And this is I just found this out recently. These are these older cottages that are not done by Lloyd Wright. This was done by an architect named Charles Dubois. And for those of you who might be familiar with architectural history, he's a big mid-century modernist, did a lot of work in Palm Springs, did tract houses. This was among one of his very, very early works. And starts doing all this incredible mid-century modernism later, but here he's just building these humble little cottages. There's a little bit of a mystery around this one, around this blueprint, because this is actually the residence for Leon Bestelli, which maybe Dingle didn't own all this land when this was done in 1942. Maybe he was still working out the ownership, but very quickly he would own it, because here's an image. This was another publication that was used to raise money for building this, called The Mansion Builder. And here's the Caravansary of Joy, which we'll look at in a minute. Here's this administration building done by Lloyd Wright. And see this square? That's that Charles Dubois cottage from the blueprint. And that's why the blueprint was in Lloyd Wright's papers, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, because he built this building around it, and he needed to know. This was built in 1942 or 43, and this is only 4 years later. And then there's these other two that are still there. And a little bit about Lloyd Wright. Very interesting guy. I feel bad for him, because if you ever try to Google Lloyd Wright, you always get his dad, Frank Lloyd Wright. And so he kind of doesn't exist on Google unless you really do your homework. His dad just kind of dominates everything. And he kind of dominates a lot in his life, too. It's kind of a complicated relationship. But this is Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., a.k.a. Lloyd or Lloyd Wright. And there he is over here, an early picture. I have some other images here for those of you who are familiar with architecture in Southern California. This is the Schindler House by Rudolf Schindler and the Lowell Health House by Neutra. They come from Vienna later. This is Irving Gill's Dodge House. Lloyd Wright was in LA doing, modernist architecture of some form. Obviously, his is organic modernism before Schindler and Neutra ever get here. So he's here earlier in Southern California doing a progressive architecture before a lot of people realize, and he doesn't really get credit for that. He was even here before his dad. Frank Lloyd Wright comes out later. And I think Lloyd may have worked with Irving Gill, who's from San Diego. This is the Dodge House a little bit later. But Gill is always considered one of the very early modernists in Southern California, one of the first people to really do modernism. Lloyd is here almost just as early. So he's very, very early, and he doesn't really get credit for being that kind of pioneer. So there's Lloyd. These are some of the other buildings that Lloyd did. You may be familiar with some of them. Before he started doing a lot of architecture, he was a set designer for Paramount. And set design informs his work. There's a real theatrical, dramatic flair to a lot of Lloyd's work. I mean, if you go to the cafeteria with those tapered, extended eaves that kind of cantilever on forever and those dynamic angles, he did the castle for the original Robin Hood with Douglas Fairbanks. And it was one of the largest film sets ever made, and that was Lloyd's castle. And he did the Hollywood Bowl. He did the original Hollywood Bowl. This is an earlier version of the band shell that's now there. The band shell that's now there, well, the one that was there for years and years was built by Allied Architects, but they basically copied Lloyd's design of this one, gave it some different dimensions, and they basically reconstructed the whole thing identically about 12 or 15 years ago. This is the Soden House by Lloyd Wright. Again, it looks like it's some sort of Mayan film set. Some of you may be familiar with the Black Dahlia, that happy story that kind of happened here. And this is Wayfarer's Chapel in Palos Verdes. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Wayfarer's Chapel. Kind of amazing. This was designed in 1947, completed in 1951. He designs this at the same time he's designing the early buildings for mental physics, the administration building and the caravansary. And they have a lot of the same character-defining features. This, by the way, is the Wayfarers Chapel is a Swedenborgian New Thought church. So Lloyd is also doing other New Thought sort of alternative spiritual discipline stuff in Southern California besides mental physics for others. So here's a plan for the caravansary. So a caravansary is like a lodging facility where if you're on a caravan and you need a place to sleep, if you're in the desert, the word caravansary was used before it was used here. And if you look at the plan of this, and I know a lot of this may be hard to read, there's a couple things going on here. This was clearly meant as a place to enjoy yourself. So the spiritualist buildings were not the first buildings made here. It was the infrastructural stuff, the administration building, and then this. This is a bocce ball court. It's a tennis court where the pool is. This was going to be the pool, a hexagon. That would have been pretty cool. And these are all the sort of lodging units. And you could see here, if you're familiar with modernism, from Europe, it tends to be boxy, flat roofs and right angles everywhere. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright and son Lloyd don't want to go along with that. They're not into that European modernism so much. So there's this phase starting in the 30s and through the 40s where both of them are using oblique angles, sort of these very odd diagonals. And they say that, their reasoning was, crystals, geodes, honeycombs, this shows up in nature. This is a naturally occurring angle. So if it shows up in nature, we could use it here. And they were experimenting with this idea of giving the rooms flow by making diagonal lines. So you're going to see a lot of 30, 60, and 120 degree angles all over the Lloyd Wright buildings, the cafeteria, the cottages, the caravansary, if you head over there. And here's the caravansary itself. So these rocks were quarried from that hill over there, and behind us, that's called desert masonry. And if you look here, there's a purposeful intention to make this building integrated with its land, to make it seem of the land. Dingle loved this land. He loved the desert. And if you look even closer, this is sort of a darker iron, boulder work here. This is a little bit lighter. I think this probably has a little bit of stain on it. I can't imagine it came out of the mountain like that, but maybe. And so there's these very subtle color gradations here as well with these pylons. This is kind of low. It hugs the ground. You can see these really fascinating kind of fins here. These extended beams originally had a sort of wicker, like a rattan, like a matting on there, a tule matting, which did not last long. But anyway, so this is the caravansary building here, a lot of hexagons. And if you notice, oh, it's coming up, I guess. I'll just show a couple of other images of this and jump to something. Oh, a little blown out, but that's okay. This is a blueprint, a drawing of the caravansary. And what this says here, this talks about the coloring. This whole building, you can see here's the tule matting when it was still there. See that right there and right there? See that? A natural material, provides shade. That was originally supposed to have a purple and violet and blue pyramidal pattern all over it was going to be bright purple and blue. I mean, can you imagine with the orange and the sunsets? Lloyd Wright is not afraid of color. Because the European modernists, they didn't like color. They really used it sparingly. So, of course, Lloyd is like, well, we're going to do the opposite of you guys. Again, we're going to color the heck out of this. And so originally these tule mats were going to be purple, like a violet and blue, basically. Purple and violet are the same thing. And then you could see the hills here about how this, and this is designed to integrate with the sloping hillside also. There's some shots of this. This is Dingle's actual writing. So he's producing these himself, and they're kind of nice. He loves nature, and he's talking about being close to the desert. Remember, he's from cold England, so this must have seemed incredibly exotic, probably even more exotic than, he had already exhausted Asia as an exotic place, so he's like, now what's left? The desert, of course. So, and this is an early project for a Thule mat house he wanted to do in Imperial Valley in 1933 by Lloyd, never done, but you could see he was thinking about this before. There's the magnificent stonework in the caravansary with Ding Le Mei inspecting. There he is. So that's his words, not mine. So, but it is magnificent. There's some details there, these oblique angles. And this is all organic architecture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about organic architecture as I show this very striking picture here. Frank Lloyd Wright first used the term organic architecture in a May 1914 issue of Architectural Record. And I'm just going to read something quickly here. Organic architecture presumes a specific consistency, if not reduction, in identifying the character of an immediate natural setting. Similarly, organic architecture presents an all-over consistency of idea. So in other words, the building, one part of the building looks the same as other parts. It's the same materials, it's the same, you don't have so much randomness. The materials that are used are not covered up or disguised as anything else other than themselves. So what you see is what you get in terms of the stonework. This stone actually holds that pier up, that sort of pylon-shaped pier. And these materials are visible and consistent both inside and out upon a given building. In this all-over cohesion, it is as if a given building was a single organism itself with distinct repeating elements akin to discs on a spine, or in the case of the caravansary, fins. So this is almost like discs on a spine here, some sort of desert creature, right? So just kind of coming out of the ground. These are hard buildings to take a picture of a lot of the time because you just end up getting the land a lot of the time. So there's not a lot of building there from that angle. And I think this is an interesting comparison. At the top, you have Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West, a very famous complex for learning from 1937. At the bottom, you have the Caravansary of Joy by Lloyd Wright, his son. This is his version of Taliesin West. So they both have the same function. You know, there was lodging and education. Dingle taught people. There's a main hall in the middle of this where he gave lectures and taught people the breathing exercises in what's today called Friendship Hall. And you could see here, look at the fins on Taliesin West, and then we have the fins here at the Caravansary. This idea of the desert masonry going inside from outside. So this is Taliesin West, and here's the Caravansary. And then the water features over here. This is the water feature at the Caravansary. There's a water feature at Taliesin. And they look so similar. Even the massings and the pylons, very, very similar. So clearly, the one is in response to the other. The Son is responding to the Father, and this is Taliesin West for the Son, right here at Mental Physics. And then he does the administration building. So again, very integrated, a lot of glass here, Joshua trees, which Dingle loved. Here's the original rendering for this. It's kind of this pink and orange. Again, not afraid of color. I don't know if anybody knows this, but the Guggenheim Museum in New York that Frank Lloyd Wright did, the round one, he proposed that originally to be hot pink. It's hot pink in early renderings, and that didn't happen, and that's a bummer. It would have been amazing to have a hot pink Guggenheim. There's the administration building, and again, with these sort of pylon-type chimneys here, which just kind of grow. Look at it, it's the same color as the dirt. It's as if it's growing right out of the ground. You know, it's the same everything. It is the earth. And then a lot of that rock work continues on the inside, too. So if you stay in some of these rooms or do a tour, the rock work comes in. Dingle gave lectures in the backyard there. So here's this patio, and there's him giving a talk. There he is in all white. And there's some really interesting markings here that are fascinating on this with red dots and whatnot. I don't know what they mean. Maybe they were put on later, but there he is giving a talk at the administration building. And there he is giving a talk inside Friendship Hall. So he did use, the buildings were for fun, especially the caravansary, but he did give lectures in there too. And I'm sure that wasn't like a lesson on how to, be a good bocce ball player. He's probably teaching mental physics, even though they did have a bocce ball court. I mentioned that twice. I love bocce ball. Okay. So an aside. Okay. Now, early on, by 1950, after some of this is made, he starts having conventions here. So if you're a mental physics practitioner, if you've given, if you've donated or you're part of it in practicing, you could come out here and stay. And in some ways, I don't want to say like it's a timeshare, mental physics timeshare, but it was kind of like it had a resort energy to it. And around 1950, at 1950, because that's the first, he starts doing conventions here. So where people can come out here and get educated to various mental physics lessons. These conventions continued on site until at least 1980, when a local newspaper announced the 128th Mental Physics Convention. So they had more than one a year. In fact, they had them all the time. They were held monthly through April through June, and then in September and October. And for example, every convention had a theme. And the 1961 themes were blessings, concentration, roses, oleanders, and sunsets. So all very kind of nice things, very some hallmark moments there. And here's people at the convention, attending in the first sanctuary of mystic Christianity. It's a little bit later. And there they are, again, a mix of people, but kind of probably veering a little older. But then again, you never know. Again, when now everybody, for all we know, they could have been 20, with time, but probably we're older than that there. Everybody always looks older in like 1800s pictures. You see pictures of somebody from like 1885, and you find out they're like 19, and it's like, what's? But anyway, so here's the 100th convention from 1970. I think that's Donald Waldrop, who took over and helped Dingle out a lot later. And just these various groups seem very happy. And it was fun. There's Dingle on his horse, and there's his daughter and his wife. And this was originally a little horse stable there. It was an agricultural building for animals, and that's still there. So some of these buildings are, some of this was about enjoying nature. He really believed that being close and non-dual with nature was a big part of feeling connected, and that's very true. It seems to be true, for nature, going for a hike or whatever, it's rejuvenating. And I think he was very much aware of that back then. Here's some later buildings later meaning a couple years after the caravansary and the administration building. This is Lloyd Wright's work from about 1955, and it starts to get even a little more radical. Tom Hines, an architectural historian who's written about Lloyd Wright a lot, says his buildings had sweeping roofs, mannered spatial configurations, and oblique wall angles. They were theatrical and overly dramatic, with a flair not seen in those of his father. Frank Lloyd Wright would never do something this kind of wild. This is a little intense, but wonderful. This is the cafeteria. There's the blueprints for it, with these really, again, just fascinating different angles here, a lot of 60-degree angles, unusual angles. And if any of you are familiar with Googie, like 1950s coffee shop architecture, pans, norms, I know Lloyd Wright didn't intend for this to be a Googie coffee shop, but this holds its own with all of those. It's an incredible design. And this roof is just like a launch pad into outer space. It's just right over there. I don't think this was originally intended to be in the ground. That's just kind of happened. But it kind of works in the ground too. I think it's kind of nice, but there's the tip of it there. I don't think there's any instructions to bury that in dirt, but I think it's wonderful. What it does, even in a way that Lloyd did not intend, is it becomes one with the earth. Is that not what organic architecture is all about? It is. It's literally a total demonstration of that phenomenon. And here's these people. This is a picture of our architecturally remarkable dining room, modern in every respect. And then you have these folks here. This guy, he just got, did a delivery or something, and he's getting himself a bite to eat. And kind of interesting to look at some of these individuals closely. And then they're all just smiling, happy, And this is the outdoor amphitheater, I believe, in the middle. I think it's been redone a little bit. It looks like it's been touched up. But remember, Lloyd Wright did the Hollywood Bowl. So the same architect who did the original Hollywood Bowl, that's still the basis of the bandshell now, did the amphitheater here. It's kind of a neat connection in a way. And here's some plans for these cottages. So these cottages are really fascinating. There's triplex and duplex units, and they all kind of hug the ground. They're at these sort of very interesting angles here. Here's a rendering for it. I think there's a really beautiful color rendering in the show that you should go see. These planters are kind of jut out from the building itself, and it's all these skylight, these open trellised points here. I don't know what's going on with the grapes. Maybe Lloyd Wright wanted to start a vineyard here. I've never seen any grapes here, but that doesn't mean they didn't happen. But this is a drawing by Lloyd Wright, just showing the sort of dynamism of these angles. And here they are themselves, and again, very jutting. And when we look at these from a distance, they're integrated into nature, into the ground, totally integrated. You could barely, again, hard to take a photo of a lot of the time. I found this recently. This is Lloyd Wright. Even I'm saying Frank, the son, Lloyd Wright, was a very, very accomplished landscape architect, and he worked for Frederick Law Olmsted, who's a really well-known landscape designer from early on. Did stuff at the Balboa Pavilion at San Diego for the Pan-Pacific exhibition. This was originally supposed to be some of the landscaping here. So this number one is Arizona cypress, some arbor vitae, and Italian cypress. They're all kind of coniferous trees. And you could see here, originally, all of these streets were going to have cypress trees. All of these pointy trees were going to make all of these lines at angles. So when you drove down 62, you would see these rows of points ascending up to the heavens, everywhere you looked, including, when you got here, you probably passed some triangular planters. Those were intended by Lloyd Wright too, and they were going to have cypress trees at their corners that shot up. So if you can imagine driving down 62, and there's 13 of them, the triangles undulate, they go up and down. You could kind of see them here. This is the road, Highway 62. We're here, and there's these triangles. And, the Trinity reference again. And they were all going to have cypress trees, kind of like these. And so you'd be able to see them from a road. They would have been like a marker as you drove along the road. And in doing this nomination, I really enjoyed finding some of these details that would be easy to miss and should probably be kept. The fact that there was a Lloyd Wright designed furnace here next to the administration building, some of these little parking triangles, just basic brickwork. And I love even the pipe column railing. This is very much of the 1950s. It's not something to modernize. If you modernize this with oak or something, it would kind of ruin it. Some things were meant to be kind of very straightforward and simple. And then just other examples, again, of this idea of alternative spiritual disciplines where they are getting away. This is the Lake Shrine for Self-Realization Fellowship with Parahamsa Yogananda. And this is Ojai. This is where Kratona moved to with Krishnamurti. It's about being away from the city. Eventually, the Theosophists moved to Ojai. They're like, Hollywood's too much. We're getting out of here. It's a little crazy. And then Krishnamurti had really fallen in love with Ojai. Moves everybody out there, and then he walks away from it. Actually, he still lived there the rest of his life. He had a place. And here's some just literature on what Dingle's interest in. This pyramid used to be off the road with white neon off Highway 62. Imagine driving by a giant white outline neon pyramid at night and seeing this. It's gone. They widened the road. Some of the Thule. There's that again. So now, since we've talked about this, you have a bearing on some of this. The caravansary, there's the amphitheater back when I think that was probably lawn, but I don't know. And then there's the parking triangles there. This was, again, never happened, but that was going to be cypress trees. There's the farm up there. And this is stuff that was never built that was meant to be here. This was called, I think, the Temple of Reverence. Can you imagine? Like, what's even going on there? This was never built. This was supposed to be the building we are in now. So this was what it was supposed to look like. And the Preceptory of Light was supposed to be the building next door. Look at these diagrams here. Just really, really fantastical. And because he's into organic architecture, he's really I think this is a light study. This is where we are. There's the caravansary, and I think this is where the sun rises at different times of the year. You know, the sun moves, right? From the, and so I think that's what this is, but I'm not certain. But I think these are light studies, and they're just kind of these really shows the detail that Lloyd Wright was concerned about. In this rendering, this is what it would have looked like with the junipers, but of course this was never made. Okay. The sign has a really interesting story here. This is the Preceptory of Light. This plaque is still there. It's 1954. But I did the research, and the Preceptory of Light was done in 1960 by another architect. The Preceptory of Light was originally going to be a building program for all of the purposely spiritual buildings on this side of the property that Dingle started in 1954. And he puts this plaque in here, probably like a New Thought move, right? Like, if I put this plaque in here, I will then raise the money. I will visualize the money being raised. To do this, I'm going to install this plaque, and the money's going to come. Well, he kind of had some problems with that. So this is a plaque designed by Lloyd Wright. He did this. And I like how there was going to be a crucifix here, and then it didn't happen, and then it ended up being a triangle. Kind of interesting. This, I think they just fixed it. But this is kind of neat. I did say Edwin J. Dingle here. I think this was probably, had been there like 60 years. But it's great, it's fixed. It looks fantastic. He started running out of money. Money became an issue here. And I've heard different stories about this. Some people blamed him, and other people, I've heard from more than one earlier practitioner saying he had a treasurer who was kind of stealing from the pot a lot, and Dingle didn't know it. And so I've heard different stories about why the money wasn't there, but the money wasn't there. And he's putting all this stuff in the mansion builder, asking people for donations. And you just send it straight to Ding Le Mei right there, just Ding Le Mei. Give it to Ding Le Mei. Building more stately mansions. The text is all kind of great. And you even have Frank Lloyd Wright writing a letter to his son, talking about the money problems with Dingle. And Frank Lloyd Wright seems kind of mean to his son sometimes here. Dear Lloyd Wright, not son or anything, I guess you are right. You lack the tact to see what the other fellow sees in what you say or do. I too think it is time for a showdown or show up with both the Murray, that was another client of theirs who owed money, and the Dingle. So I've written each a note in serio-pleasant vein to see what happens. Kindly forward the 2 letters to the right address. A copy is enclosed to you that may make you mad, but stand up to it. Affection, Frank Lloyd Wright. So money was an issue, and eventually Lloyd Wright left the project. He wasn't getting, he had to leave. He was patient. He designed all the stuff, and money was an issue. It may not have been Dingle's fault. I'm not assigning blame here, but I've heard different stories, like I said, but money was a concern, and he left. So Dingle turned to O.K. Earl Jr., Orrin Kenneth Earl Jr., who is a ... Pasadena builder, according to this newspaper clipping. And Orrin Kenneth Earl Jr., O.K. Earl Jr., did a lot of structures in LA and Southern California. He was known for doing structures quick, fast, cheap, just get them up. But he hired some good architects under him. He tried to be thoughtful. He did actually pioneer the tilt-up concrete building for Southern California. A lot of those are easy to drive by. But it was all about what was economical. Dingle did the right thing. He did what he needed to do. And the building's wonderful. It's not half bad at all. So here's a blueprint for the first sanctuary of mystic Christianity. The architect working on this under him was named Ivo Klarick. Don't know much about him. Here's an image of the building now, and that might be yours. That's my girlfriend shot that. So she's an architectural photographer. She does really good work if you need to hire her. So. This is the first sanctuary of mystic Christianity in March of 1959. So right when it opened, and you can see, this is from a scrapbook I found here, and there it is. And in kind of this sort of ascending spire-like, he probably saw what Lloyd Wright did and tried to reference some of that. But for those of you who are kind of familiar with architecture, you may know the building on the right. This is North Christian Church by Eero Saarinen, who's a very well-known mid-century modernist. This was done in Columbus, Indiana, which is kind of a haven for modernism. And look at how similar the buildings are. They're almost identical. And this is a very, very famous building. It's been in architecture books all over the place. And this was designed in 1959 and completed in 1964. But you go back to this and you're like, wait a minute, this was done in 1959. Like, what's going on here? So there's an architect coming a little bit later that I'll talk about who worked for Saarinen. And he probably showed him pictures. I can't confirm it, I can't guarantee it, I don't know for sure, but who's to say that the very building we're standing and sitting in right now did not inform this world-famous building by Eero Saarinen? They sure look alike. They're very, very similar, and we have the dates on when this was designed, and it was way before this one. Kind of an interesting factoid. And it made it onto a record. I love his records. I actually haven't listened to this, but the fact that Dingle was such a marketer, and there's a record you could listen to. This is the Preceptory of Light. This is actually in the concrete right before you get in. It's our Preceptory of Light. And this is another O.K. Earl building done with Harold Zook. Zook is a Pasadena modernist responsible for a movement called the contemporary style, which is a mix of mid-century modern and ranch. This zigzag with these sort of knife blade beams is very Zook. And there's the inside of it with these sort of red pyramid lights. There's that lamp. I think that's the lamplighter lamp right there. Very, very intact. I mean, this seems like a time capsule. And then this was one of the last buildings made here, the meditation complex. This was called Inspiration Heights. And I think this actual rendering is right over there. I think a much prettier version than this. But this was by Zook, working under O.K. Earl Jr. Yeah, see, it's cut off. Inspiration Heights. And, couldn't afford Lloyd Wright, but had some not bad stuff. Very much of the era with these zigzags and, the open skylight thing. There's kind of borrowing from Lloyd Wright. And that's very much Zook. And here's some other work by Zook. If you're from Pasadena, here's the Saga Motor Inn, which is done by Zook under O.K. Earl Jr. And some contemporary ranch architecture here. Mid-century modernism meets the ranch style, hugging the ground and low-pitched roofs, and actually a very generous use of T111, which is kind of Awful, people don't like that material. It's kind of like a very generic plywood, but Contemporary Ranch used it quite nicely in various bays and whatnot. And anyway, and if you look closely at this building, you can see there's little shout outs or, this is very similar in design in terms of the low slung roof and some of the brickwork and the protruding screens and whatnot. And this is the last building here. This is an interesting story. So this was not done by O.K. Earl. This building was not intended. It happened after the fact. Dingle's son, Richard, who was going to take over everything, died unexpectedly in 1959. Legionnaire's disease, he caught it here working on an air conditioning unit. So this chapel, beautiful chapel right behind us, go out that doorway and you're there, was made in honor of Richard, Edwin's son Richard. And this was built in kind of an expressionist mid-century modern style. You can see these folded plate roofs here. This is a little plaque in honor of Richard Lampier Dingle. This was the original sort of planter. This is now switched out with a fountain. And this is, the architect who did this is this gentleman here, Arturs Damros, who was Latvian, studied architecture in Germany, and he was a mental physics practitioner. And there's a little model of a little model of this. There it is, and there's Dingle. And here's some images of that over there. And Damros was a remarkable graphic designer and a printmaker, and this is some of his artwork. His granddaughter gave this to me. I thought was very nice. Just remarkable, remarkable work. He's the one who worked for Eero Saarinen. And he probably still had friends there and said, hey, look at this cool building, And a couple of years later, you got North Christian Church. Go figure. Damros worked on something else kind of remarkable at Disneyland with Walt Disney. He worked on adventure through inner space. If any of you, grew up here and remember this, where you become a molecule and you become smaller and smaller. I don't know what he did on this. None of the Disney websites talk about it, and there seems to be 1 million of them. But his granddaughter told me that he worked on this, that he did work with Walt on this. So who knows if it was just infrastructure or if he designed the whole thing. But I do think it's kind of interesting that there's somehow a connection between mental physics and becoming a molecule at Disneyland. It's kind of nice spiritual connections in there somewhere, but just some work that I found here. There's the inside of it. It's still very intact. Beautiful purple light. So Dingle, after his son dies, he takes a little time off. He's sad, but he continues on through the 60s. He moves here. The administration building becomes his house, and he's still putting out issues of Mansion Builder, including the birthday issue for himself. Happy birthday! This is him with a later wife, Mary Jane. I can't remember if she's number 3 or I think she's number 4. He got married a few times. Looks very happy out here, very tan, very rested. Looks like he's having a good time. He's happy. All the breathing exercises, the pranayama, the nature, the sun in this case. So, he slows down. After a brief illness on January 27th, 1972, at age 90, he passed away up here in Yucca Valley. According to the Los Angeles Times, who wrote a really nice sort of complimentary obituary about him after his death, enrollment in his mail order program still numbered 5,000. They paid for lessons in breathing, diet, meditation, and mystic concepts. And then Dingle had over 214,000 students over the course of mental physics, and dating back to its initial 1927 inception. The obituary described mental physics as, quote unquote, one of Southern California's most enduring religious sects. Here's some images here, some later stuff here with the Richard Lampier Dingle Memorial Chapel. And he produced all these himself. They're kind of great with this cutout stuff here. And recently, some of the mental physics practitioners from before did a little ceremony right on this stage. There was a little bit of a resurgence about a year and a half ago. It was nice to see some tradition sort of carrying on. And this is kind of where we wrap up. So this is a remarkable site to talk about the National Register nomination. I love this image here of the Caravansary of Joy with all of these preceptors and their own signatures and their quotes, with this guy sort of pointing at all of them. Dingle's writing. He's clearly, I mean, he did the effort. Seems like he was working all the time, either writing or printing. Beautiful publications, and I think the very quality of these is kind of what got him, some interest. And it was easy to recognize Dingle as a significant figure for the National Register nomination. Now, we can't, when we write the National Register nomination, we don't call somebody out because, oh, they're so spiritual, or, we got to keep a boundary between church and state. But just on what he did in China alone is remarkable, let alone what he ends up doing here and when he does it. He was very early to all of this for Southern California. So he's very much part of an important Southern California narrative. And he aimed high in terms of his architects. He was important, and he aimed high, and he was part of a milieu. And for the combination of those things, this was listed. So here's the Caravansary of Joy, and this is a letter from the 24th of this year. The property was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a federal designation on January 17th. So, and thank you. And it was, definitely, I was very honored and lucky to work on this, and just blessed in a way, and I have so much gratitude toward Terry and Marie and the rest of everybody who helped. It was definitely a team effort, and just a very wonderful, worthy property that when a lot of people drive by, they may not realize what this is, how magical it is, how remarkable it is, and how important it is for history for a variety of reasons. And now that this is secured, perhaps it can stay here for perpetuity. Thank you. Thank you.